Take a stopwatch, click the start button, and look at the second hand, trying to be aware of yourself, concentrating on the thought, I am James Cutzinger. Please substitute your own name, of course. I am now. I am here. Try not to think about anything else. Simply follow the movements of the second hand and be aware of yourself, your name, your existence, the place where you are. Keep all other thoughts away. If you give this all your effort and are really persistent, you might be able to do this for a minute, probably no more. And if you try to repeat the experiment right away, you'll find it more difficult than the first time, surprising though that might be. That's how fragile our consciousness is, even with focused effort. And of course, most of the time, we're not really focused. Most of the time, we're inwardly almost totally out of control. Which is why the Hindus would say that we need to practice yoga, our subject last time. Our subject this time is time itself. We want to talk about the Hindu understanding of time, and of course I want to contrast that, as I did in the lecture you read in Paths of Return, with other possible ways of understanding time, to get a sense of Hindu chronology, the Hindu understanding of the flow of time. Augustine, St. Augustine, an early church father, 4th and 5th centuries, famously asked, "What then is time?" If no one asks me, he said, I know what it is. But if I wish to explain it to someone who asks, I no longer know. Time is a mystery. Time is a very, very strange phenomenon. And different traditions, different religions envisage it differently. That's our project today, to begin discussing this with, of course, again, Hinduism in our focus. There's the question of how time is shaped, if you'll allow me to use that term. In the Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, as I mentioned in Paths of Return, the shape of time, the picture of time, is more or less linear, as though you're going down this railroad track. Beginning, middle, end, that's time. In the South Asian religions, however, Hinduism and Buddhism both, time is more like this spiral. It has a curvature to it. It has a cyclicality to it. It comes round. It has this sort of shape. And then there's the question of what direction time's moving in. Are we up? Are we going down? Are we going sideways? How are we moving through time? Here I contrasted the typical modern and contemporary understanding of time, which I've called here progressive and evolutionary. The point of the little diagram is to say that as we move forward in time, the quality of things is getting progressively better. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, there aren't dips and down periods as well. But I think most modern people, they'd say, we've got it better than those people had it, back in the Middle Ages. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have, spaceships. They didn't have penicillin. We've progressed from that time. And then, of course, those people in the Middle Ages were far better off than than cavemen, poor old Neanderthal man who didn't have, much of anything. So that's the general picture I think that many people in our culture would have, a kind of progressive, moving in the direction of higher quality as time goes on. As I said in Paths of Return, that's in contrast, however, with both traditional Western religions and with Hindu and also with Buddhist understanding of time, where the picture is more, I'll call it regressive or devolutionary. As we move forward in time, left to right on the timeline, the quality is going more or less downhill. Things are becoming worse. Things are becoming a little bit more chaotic. The second law of thermodynamics, if you want to put it in scientific terms, is at work. And we're moving toward increasing randomness and decreasing order. That's the traditional. Now, I don't say it's the modern Jewish or modern Christian or modern Muslim understanding, because Jews and Christians and Muslims have been in many cases affected, impacted by the views around them. But traditionally, it would have been much like this. So also with Hinduism in the South Asian picture, more or less regressive and devolutionary. Although in this case, of course, in the Hindu tradition, you have successive ages to talk about, not just one flow, but different patterns of flow in the downhill direction. Ages 1, 2, I put ... with 3 because, of course, there are 4 ages. I couldn't put them all on this screen. Here are those 4. As I've mentioned, and you know from your reading already, Hindu chronology divides any given cycle of time, called a Mahayuga, into 4 basic periods, 4 ages. Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, Kali Yuga. Satya means truth, so the Yuga of truth to begin with. Treta is the word for third, Dvapara is the word for second. The Kali Yuga, don't make a mistake here, this is not the Kali, the goddess Kali that we've looked at before. Fierce though she might be, she's understood to be a benevolent being. This is a Kali demon, a demonic Kali, a demon named Kali, who's responsible for the chaos of the final age in this sequence. As I again mentioned in the lecture you read, these would correspond more or less to the traditional ancient Greek and Roman understandings of a golden age, a silver age, a bronze age, and an iron age. Notice for the Hindus, these different ages decrease in their length from 1,728,000 solar years as we understand it, the length of time that it takes our planet to make one full revolution around the sun. The Satya Yuga was 1,728,000 of those years long. And the length of the ages decreases all the way down to the Kali Yuga, 432,000 years. But notice here, more importantly than those numbers, the quality of the ages is also moving in the downhill direction. Satya Yuga, they say, the Yuga of truth, virtue reigned supreme. And they have this interesting metaphor for each of these ages. In that age, if you pictured this as a cow, the cow being sacred to the Hindu tradition, the cow is standing there on all 4 of her legs, very stable position. In that period, human stature, the height of the average human being in the Satya Yuga, was 21 cubits. You know what a cubit is? It's basically the length from the tip of your middle finger down to your elbow. So, I mean, everybody's cubit's going to be a little bit different, but let's say that's roughly, I don't know, it is on me anyway, like a foot and a half. So people were 30 feet tall in the Golden Age, and death occurred only when one chose to die at that point. Now, if you're thinking, and I hope you are thinking a bit here, about Jewish and Christian understandings of Eden, paradise, before the fall of man, in that context, too, man was immortal. Man would not have died. Death did not occur in that sphere of existence. So perhaps we could say what the Hindus are calling the Satya Yuga would be correspondingly what the Jew or the Christian, or the Muslim for that matter, would call Eden, pre-fallen Eden. Then the next Yuga, Silver Age, Treta Yuga, people are only 3/4 virtuous and 1/4 sinful. And the cow, poor lady, is now on 3 legs, a little more precarious. Human beings are 14 cubits tall, so that's still really big. That's 20 feet or something like that. And they live about 10,000 years. Well, that's a long time compared to the way we live, but obviously much shorter than if you don't have to die at all. Dvapara Yuga, Bronze Age, people are half virtuous, half sinful. The cow's now on 2 legs. She's going to fall over pretty quick. People are 7 cubits tall, so what's that, like 10 feet maybe? They're big people still. They live 1,000 years. And here, notice I put in brackets. You can compare that maybe to the figure of Methuselah in what the Jews called the Hebrew Bible, Christians called the Old Testament, OT, who lived to be 969 years old. Well, that's about 1,000. And then finally, the Kali Yuga, and that's the age that we're in, is mostly sinful and not so much virtuous. 1/4 virtue, 3/4 sin. The cow's on 1 leg. I don't know how if you're a cow you stand on 1 leg, but that's certainly very, very unstable and precarious. People are 3.5 cubits high on average, and that'd be 5 foot something, so that's about right. And it mostly lived to be about 100 years. So that's the devolution chronologically in terms of virtue and height and length of life as the Hindus understand these 4 yugas. Now, then there's also the issue of how long time has lasted, the extent of time. You could put it differently. When did the universe come into being? Here, the traditional, and again I underscore the word traditional Western, so Christian, Jewish, Muslim answer would be it's only a few thousand years old. Orthodox Judaism, for example, dates the creation of the universe, the creation of the world as we understand it, from the 7th of October, 3,761 years before Christ. There was this, 17th century Anglican bishop, James Ussher, who did his own sort of calculation and dating, and he came up with a date of 23 October 4004 BC. So not very old, right? I mean, relatively speaking. The modern scientific answer, of course, is much longer. Scientists are now saying the universe is, close to 14 billion years old. Our planet, maybe 4.5 billion years old. So much longer than the traditional Western answer. Well, the traditional Hindu answer, which we find in, again, another set of sacred texts, scriptures in India called the Puranas. The Puranic Hindu answer to the question is that the universe came into being several trillion years ago, roughly 311 trillion years ago. Where did they get that figure? Well, I mean, I'm not going to explain it completely because I don't understand it completely, but here's some of the calculations that go into it. So we've looked at these 4 different yugas, Krita, Treta, Dvapara, Kali, decreasing in length, but increasing in speed. Remember I said that in the lecture you read. That's an interesting thing. Somebody has said it's sort of like sand in an hourglass. You fill the top compartment with sand, and you watch the top of that top compartment of sand, and it doesn't really seem like anything's happening. But as it goes down, there's a spinning sort of motion, a kind of vortex in the middle of the sand in the upper compartment, and things are moving faster and faster and faster and faster, and then suddenly, whoosh, all the sand goes down to the bottom. Well, that's kind of an image and metaphor for how time flows in this Hindu perspective, faster and faster and faster as time goes on. Anyway, all of these 4 yugas, Krita, Treta, Dvapara, Kali, add up to what they call a Mahayuga, or Great Age, which, if you add up the figures I gave you on the previous screen, ends up being a total of 4,320,000 of what we call years, solar years. All right, now, 1,000 Mahayugas, or 4.32 billion years, is what they call a kalpa. And they have an interesting image for this as well. Picture a granite cube, 1 mile high, 1 mile long, 1 mile deep, a big cube of granite. And then imagine that once every 100 years, somebody walks by. I guess we should say one of these 30 feet tall people walks by with a cloak, a gown, and the gown just sort of brushes the side of that cube as the person passes by. Well, a kalpa is how long it would take for that motion and that motion alone, every 100 years, to erode that entire granite cube. Sounds to me actually like it would take more than 4.32 billion years for that to happen, but that's the image that they use. Now, you have to double that. Take 2 kalpas. 2 kalpas are the equivalent of 24 of our hours, notice in quotation mark, what we would call hours, in the life of Brahma. Remember who Brahma is? That's the creator god. He's the one who brings the universe into being to start with. 24 hours in his life, as he understands life, would therefore be 8.64 billion years. Now, Brahma has a night and Brahma has a day, a manvantara and a pralaya. Like us, Brahma is awake some of the time and he's asleep some of the time. So a 24-hour period in his life includes both his waking and sleeping. 1 year in Brahma's life would be 3,110,400,000,000 of our solar years. And the life of Brahma, taking his life to be, I guess they say everybody lives to be 100 years old, And so Brahma has a 100-year lifespan as well. But his 100 years are going to be that previous number, obviously times times 100, and we're going to end up with 311.04 trillion solar years, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is how old our universe is. And by the way, some Hindus calculate and they say it's currently around 11 a.m. on the first day of Brahma's 51st year. That's the date, in case you wanted to know where we are in the span. So the point of all this, the details aren't important really, but I'm just trying to accentuate the vast understanding that Hindus have of what time is and how long time has lasted. There's also the issue of cyclicality in terms of life after death. All right, so every religion at least that I know of, has something to say, however minimal, about what happens to us when we die, after we exit planet Earth. And in the Hindu tradition, we talked about this in the lecture you read, there's a belief in reincarnation. I wanted to distinguish that word, though, from other terms having to do with the passage of the soul into a different context when it dies. Reincarnation technically has to do with a repeated or cyclical return of a soul to live in another life in a new body. So repeated, return and return and return. You die, you come back, you die, you come back, you die, you come back. There's the term also sometimes used in this discussion, transmigration. And that's simply the passage of the soul at death into another body. And that could actually just happen once. And then you're free or you're done or, I don't know, you're annihilated or something like that. That's just a one-time thing. Reincarnation is a repetition of that. Then there's this interesting word palingenesis, which is the return of the soul of somebody who's died into the body of another person or even an animal. Now, Hindus would say reincarnation can take place into the body of an animal. A human being can become an animal next time around, and vice versa. An animal can, as it were, move up in the hierarchy and become a human being in its next incarnation. So palingenesis would actually apply in a way also to the Hindu perspective. And so also would metempsychosis. That's the reverse. Palingenesis is the coming back of a soul. Metempsychosis is the passage of a soul at death into the body of another person or an animal in some future life. So this is just technical vocabulary, but interesting ways of understanding what happens as we die according to these traditions. Krishna, we've mentioned Krishna, and we've mentioned the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita on this whole subject of reincarnation, and I quote, "There never was a time when I didn't exist, nor you, nor any of these kings." He's referring to this, the battlefield again. Remember the context? All of the nobility in both of these armies are lined up on both sides of the battlefield. And Krishna, as it were, is gesturing across the field and saying, nor was there a time when any of these people, these kings, these nobility, these fighters, these warriors didn't exist either. Nor is there a future in which we shall cease to be. Now, just as the dweller in the body passes through childhood, youth, and old age. Let's stop right there. We all know that we are changing, in fact, all the time, right? Science tells us all the cells in your body basically die and regenerate. There are new cells coming in all the time. And what is it, like every, 5 or 6 or 7 years, you basically have an entire new body. And yet somehow we're the same. You're still you, whatever age you might be, even though your body's not the same as it was a few years ago. So just as the dweller in the body, the you-ness of you, your soul, your spirit, yourself, your ego, whatever you want to call it here now, passes through all of these stages. So, Krishna says, at death, he merely passes into another kind of body. The wise are not deceived by that. And then an interesting metaphor. Worn out garments are shed by the body. Worn out bodies are shed by the dweller within the body. New bodies are donned by the dweller just as if they were garments. So just like taking off clothes and putting on clothes, so bodies are taken off and put on in the process of reincarnation. Then, again, going back to the reading in Paths of Return, you already know about what we call the law of karma, the Hindu law of karma. I called it the spiritual law of cause and effect. For every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction, the physicists say. Well, this is the spiritual equivalent of that particular law. Here I would appeal to the Svetasvatara Upanishad, a different Hindu sacred text. We've seen some of these Upanishads before. Quote, "The quality of the soul determines the future body, earthly or airy, heavy or light. Its thoughts, the thoughts of the soul, its actions can lead it to freedom in a future life, a future body, or lead it to bondage, life after life after life after life." So how you are, the kind of person you are, the quality of your life, the kinds of choices you make, the thoughts that you have, the deeds you perform in this life are in some way reflective of a life that you lived before this time round. And what you're doing right now, what you're thinking and feeling and choosing and so forth right now, is in turn going to impact your own future life, a reincarnation next time around. I simplified a very complex matter in Paths of Return by saying we can understand this in terms of what the Hindus call gunas. The gunas are three distinct qualities: sattva, which is light; rajas, which is fiery and expansive; tamas, which is dark and descending. And these gunas or qualities, as I said, describe, qualify, are attributes of all kinds of things, including the food that you eat and all sorts of stuff. For right now, we're focusing just on how these gunas affect human personalities, different personality types. The sattvic person, I said, in the lecture you read, is the person whose goal, whose aim in life, whose purushartha is primarily moksha, liberation. This is the person with high ideals, who is seeking to go beyond anything in this world. And the destiny of such a person is, I call it here, angelic. It's to become like the gods, like the devas, in one's next life. A rajasic person, I'm taking this and turning it into an adjective, a rajasic personality type is the extroverted person who is seeking primarily the aim of dharma, good deeds, service to society, service to his fellow man. His destiny is going to be, again simplistically put, to come back into a state analogous to what we humans now occupy here on this planet, a central state, a state that has some things that are good and some things that are bad about it. And then finally, the tamasic person, the person in whom the guna of tamas predominates, is the person whose goals, whose aims, whose wants, whose desires in life are primarily success and fame and power or personal pleasure, sensual pleasure. And that person, to the extent that he's dominated by those desires, is going to come back, says the Hindu, in an animal state, a state lower than the state that he occupies now. The quotation at the bottom, just again a Christian parallel, a Christian comparative parallel. Paul, Galatians 6:7, "Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap." That's very much a Christian equivalent of what we're calling here the law of karma. I couldn't resist this cartoon. Somebody sitting there at the reincarnation desk, I guess talking to the person who assigns your new life, your new body, and being told, and the person looks somewhat concerned, "You're going back as a mayfly. Have a nice day." Because, of course, mayflies just live for one day. So this is maybe not so good a reincarnational destiny. Or maybe it is a good thing. You only get stuck for 24 hours and then you get a new option. I guess if you're a really, really, really virtuous mayfly for those 24 hours, maybe you can come back up in the hierarchy in the Hindu understanding. I am, of course, teasing here. Now, some caveats, some warnings. I mentioned a couple of these in the lecture you read, but the first one I don't really think that I stressed, and I want to stress it here. Reincarnation, as the Hindus understand it, doesn't mean that you as you understand yourself now, the personality that you're familiar with now, with certain attributes, talents, biographical history, body type, I don't know, avocation, interests, all that kind of stuff, that you doesn't come back again. And it certainly doesn't return to, and I put this in quotation marks too, to this world. It can't come back. You can't come back to this world because this world itself is constantly flowing. It's in flux. It's constantly changing. There's no coming back. The ancient pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus said, "Pantochrei," which in Greek means all things flow. And he famously said, to illustrate this, you can't step twice into the same river. Well, why? Well, because the same river ain't the same river the next time you step in. It's moved along its channel. So you don't come back to the same world in reincarnation. What comes back is some sort of deeper reality in you than your personality, something down closer to what we've called self that returns. And what it returns to is always new. It's always different. It's always a changed environment. Second caveat, second qualification here. And I did talk about this, of course, in Paths of Return. It's not reincarnation you're after. You don't want to come back again. It's moksha, liberation, freedom. That's the true goal of life. And I added, and the Hindus would add here, bliss, the bliss of Ananda, the bliss of supreme joy, what a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim would simply call heaven, the next life, the afterlife, the kingdom of God. The joy of that is not and should not be dependent upon, shouldn't be a function of, as the way I express it here on this slide, of environment or circumstances. Somebody whose happiness depends on how nice things are around them is never going to actually be truly, essentially happy, not going to have the quality of Ananda. So that's a qualification that I added when I talked about why it is that you don't even want to come back as a god, an angel. Because the angels themselves have lifespans, you see. And they can maybe do good things, or they can maybe, well, I guess Christians would say some of the angels, in fact, did do some bad things. They're called the demons. So being in that domain, in that dimension, in that region of existence is no guarantee of absolute, total, eternal happiness. Things can go sour. You can make the wrong choices even then. So environment and circumstances are not the issue. You want to have an inward joy that withstands any circumstance. And then the third caveat, qualification, or warning here is to remind you again of something you've already read. Short of moksha, there's nothing better than being a human being. We should not be envious of the gods, the angels, the beings above us, because they have it, as it were, too good. And they maybe get bored. They maybe lose some of their drive, their aspiration. It's also better to be human than being an animal, because the animals have it too bad, too suffering situation. So we're right in the middle, the Hindus say. And it's important to take advantage of the state that we're in while we've got it, not to delay, not to postpone, not to say, oh, well, Hindus believe in reincarnation, I'll just wait a while. Human birth, they say, is incredibly difficult to obtain. The odds are stacked immensely against you. And my little turtle here, my sea turtle, is to remind you of the image that I used in the reading. The Hindus say, coming back as a human is kind of like one little sea turtle someplace in the vast oceans, surfacing to take a breath of air, just where there happens to be one single in all of the ocean's wooden ring, floating on the surface and sticking his head up through the ring. Well, the odds are against that. And the odds are against coming back as a human. So use your opportunity while you've got it, they say. Then finally, the last thing that I wanted to say, and then I'll introduce my two saints here briefly as well, is to talk about the timing of moksha. Moksha, again, liberation or freedom. As I mentioned in the reading, liberation can come and does come for those who achieve it, usually after death or at the moment of death. So they call that krama mukti, liberation after death, videha mukti, liberation at the moment of death. But there are and have been a few very, very rare souls, the Hindus say, who've actually achieved total liberation, even while they're still living in this world, before they die. They already have the category of being completely freed from all everything that would stand against them otherwise. And the examples of that I gave in the lecture that you know about, you've read about Swami Ramdas, I hope, in a book of saints. And then I also mentioned the second figure, and I gave you a video clip about him, Sri Ramana Maharshi, are two examples, recent examples, 20th century examples of people who have attained that very rare state. We call them Jivan Muktas, liberated souls. You could simply call them, I suppose, saints. Swami Ramdas is an excellent example of someone in this category whose path was primarily one of bhakti, devotion and love toward God, in his case, the god Rama. Someone who follows the path of bhakti is a bhakta. And then Sri Ramana Maharshi, wonderful example, again, of a Jivan Mukta, who achieved that high state by following a path of knowledge. Jnani is the path of knowledge, and the Jnanan is the one who follows that path. Here is our little friend Swami Ramdas. I called your attention to some passages here that you might want to look back at that are quite interesting in terms of his life and his attainments and his sanctity and his purity of heart. One that I liked especially was when a monkey steals his glasses from him. What's his first thought? Well, my first thought, probably your first thought would be, let me get those back. Where'd that monkey go? Darn monkey anyway. His first thought was, God must be going to restore my eyesight. There was no negativity and no doubt and no whatever hesitation or worry or anxiety, anything like that. He was, I guess God's going to give my eyesight back. Interesting anecdote, interesting insight into how a saint's consciousness is so different from mine anyway. So there's Swami Ramdas sitting there looking very happy. He's got Ananda already. He's a Jivan Mukta. And then here's the other man. I hope you've already watched the video clip. You will have seen him already. Here's a photo of him, Sri Ramana Maharshi. Again, extraordinary person, being by any account. I wanted to end, I mentioned at the end of the lecture in Paths of Return, I would tell you a story I was given, I heard about from someone who actually met Sri Ramana right at the end of his life. That's what I've got a little note here to myself to tell you Rama's account. This is not Rama, the god Rama. This is a friend of mine, actually the son of Ananda Kumaraswamy. Remember reading Ananda Kumaraswamy's Paths to the Same Summit? Well, I got to know his son, named Rama. Now, Rama, curiously enough, converted from Hinduism to Christianity and became a Christian priest. Pretty interesting story. Well, I'm not going to go into that story right now. But Rama, as a very young man in his teens, I think he was 18 or 19 years old, was in India traveling, 1950, 4950, and met Ramana Maharshi and was actually there the day they performed surgery on Sri Ramana's, I think it was his left arm. He had a cancerous tumor. And Rama, looking back on this period from the point of being in his 70s or 80s when I got to know him, he himself was a surgeon. Rama was a surgeon. So he had a kind of a professional take on what had happened. He said Sri Ramana refused any anesthetic. He said he didn't need anything. And so the surgeons just started, cutting into his arm, cutting a hole in his arm. And all of the devotees, the disciples, the followers, the friends of Sri Ramana Maharshi were standing round, according to Rama, with these anxious, horrified looks on their faces, and some of them were crying, and some of them were saying, isn't that hurting? Sri Ramana, doesn't that hurt you? And his response was simply, this body is suffering. This body is suffering. And then he started telling jokes to cheer up the people who were so worried about the pain in his body. But the point of the story is to show the incredible detachment he had achieved in some way through his practices from the pain in his body. He was no longer concerned about that at all. What was his concern? His only concern was a compassionate concern for the people around who were themselves suffering because he was suffering. Very, very interesting, profoundly impressive, and for me at least, I guess, something to admire and something to emulate, if at all possible. So a couple of Jivan Muktas, people who achieved, according to the Hindu tradition at least, the very, very high calling of moksha while still alive in this world.